The heat has a weight to it by late afternoon. It settles over the hills outside Jerusalem like something almost solid, pressing down on canvas tents that have gone the color of the dust they stand in. It is July, in the year 1099, and an army has been waiting outside these walls for more than a month. They are not the army that set out 4 years earlier. That army was larger, better fed, better shod, and full of men who are now dead. From hunger, from fever, from the countless small disasters of a march that stretched across 2,000 miles of unfamiliar country. The soldiers who remain are thinner. Their mail is rusted in places, patched in others. Many of them are walking, their horses long since eaten or lost, and yet here they are, on a ridge above a city that most of them had only ever heard about in sermons, in stories told by pilgrims who had made the journey and returned, in the hushed reverence reserved for the one place on earth where, they believed, God himself had walked. Jerusalem's walls rise pale and ochre in the evening light, catching the last sun in a way that makes the stone look almost warm, almost gentle, which it is not. Behind those walls is a garrison prepared for a siege, cisterns that have been deliberately fouled, wells outside the city blocked or poisoned so that the army camped beyond cannot easily draw water. The land around the city is dry scrubland, punctuated by old olive terraces and outcrops of pale rock, and it offers little comfort to men who have already marched through worse. There is a stillness to the camp in these last quiet hours, before an assault that historians would later be able to date with some precision, though the men waiting in the dusk had no way of knowing what would be written about them, or how. Somewhere in the tents, priests are hearing confessions. Somewhere, carpenters are still working on siege towers built from timber that had to be carried in pieces from the coast, because there was almost no wood to be found near the city itself. Somewhere, men who have not eaten a full meal in days are trying to sleep, knowing that in the morning, or in a morning soon, they will be asked to climb ladders and wooden towers under a rain of stones and fire toward walls that have turned back armies before. To understand why so many thousands of people were willing to travel so far, to endure so much, and to arrive at this one dry, deceptively quiet evening outside an ancient city, it helps to go back, not to the siege itself, and not even to the beginning of the march. It helps to go back several decades earlier, to a world that had not yet imagined anything like a crusade, a world of small kingdoms and old empires, of quiet pilgrim roads and distant, rising powers, all moving slowly and separately toward a single summer. Before we go there, a warm welcome, as always, to the sleepy historian. Tonight's story is a long one, the longest one in many ways that this channel has told. It stretches across nearly 2 centuries, from a small church council in the middle of France to the final loss of a coastal city on the eastern Mediterranean, and it touches lives across 3 continents. There is no need to hold on to every date or every name. Let the story move at its own pace, and let yourself move with it, or drift away from it, whenever sleep is ready to take you. Settle in. We begin, as these stories often do, with a world that has no idea what is coming. To understand the 11th century, it helps to stop thinking of Europe as a single place. In the year 1050, there was no country called France in the way we would recognize one. No unified Germany. No single Italy. There were kingdoms, certainly, and an emperor or two. But real power tended to sit much closer to the ground, with dukes and counts and minor lords who built their own castles, raised their own soldiers, and often answered to distant kings only when it suited them. Historians sometimes describe this as a fragmented political landscape. And fragmented is the right word. Authority was local. Loyalty was personal, sworn between a lord and the men who served him, and it did not always travel far up the chain. Into this fragmented world, one institution reached almost everywhere: the church. Bishops held land and often wielded as much practical power as any count. Monasteries were centers of learning, of charity, and of considerable wealth. And running through all of it was a shared religious culture that gave ordinary life its rhythm: feast days, fasts, the sacraments, the fear of sin, and the hope of forgiveness. For a knight who had spent his life in violence, and violence was, in an important sense, a knight's profession, the question of what happened to his soul was not an abstract one. The church offered penance for sin, and pilgrimage was one of its oldest and most respected forms. A journey to a holy place, undertaken with hardship and humility, was believed to cleanse the pilgrim in ways that ordinary life at home could not. And no destination carried more weight than Jerusalem. It was, in the geography of medieval Christian imagination, the center of the world, quite literally, on many medieval maps, which placed Jerusalem at the middle of the earth with the 3 known continents arranged around it. It was the city of Christ's death and resurrection, the site of the Holy Sepulchre, and for centuries it had drawn Christian pilgrims from across Europe, often traveling in large informal groups for safety, along routes that passed through Byzantine territory and into the Islamic world beyond. Jerusalem had been under Muslim rule since the 7th century, but for most of that time, pilgrimage had continued with relatively little disruption. Christian communities lived on in the city and across the region: Greek Orthodox, Armenian, Syriac, Coptic, and others, under Muslim governments that, with notable and sometimes brutal exceptions, generally tolerated their presence as protected communities, subject to specific taxes and restrictions, but permitted to worship. Further east, the Islamic world was itself far from unified. By the 11th century, the old idea of a single caliph ruling all Muslims had long since given way to political reality. The Abbasid Caliphate, based in Baghdad, retained enormous religious prestige, but had lost most of its direct political power, overshadowed for decades by a Shia dynasty called the Buyids, and now, increasingly, by a new and rising force, the Seljuk Turks. In Egypt, an entirely separate and rival caliphate, the Shia Fatimids, ruled from Cairo, controlling a wealthy state that included, for much of this period, Jerusalem itself. The rivalry between the Sunni Abbasids and the Shia Fatimids was not a minor theological disagreement. It was a deep political and religious fault line running through the entire Islamic world, and it would matter enormously for how the region responded decades later when armed pilgrims began arriving from the west. And to the north and east of all of this sat Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, Greek-speaking, Orthodox Christian, centered on Constantinople, a city so large and so wealthy that Western visitors struggled to describe it without sounding as though they were exaggerating. Byzantium considered itself the direct continuation of the Roman Empire, unbroken since antiquity, and by the standards of the 11th century, it very much still was, a sophisticated bureaucratic state with a professional army, a stable currency, and a reach that touched Italy, the Balkans, and Anatolia. That reach, however, was about to be tested in ways the empire had not fully anticipated, and it is there, on a battlefield in eastern Anatolia, that the story of the Crusades really begins to take its shape. In August of 1071, near the town of Manzikert in eastern Anatolia, A Byzantine army led by the Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes met a Seljuk force under Sultan Alp Arslan. The battle itself was not, by the standards of the age, an unusually large engagement, and Alp Arslan had not even come to Anatolia looking for a decisive confrontation with Byzantium. His attention was largely fixed on Fatimid Egypt. But the battle went badly for the Byzantines, compounded by internal Byzantine politics. A rival faction within the army withdrew or turned back during the fighting, and Romanos himself was captured. The defeat at Manzikert was not, in itself, an immediate catastrophe. Romanos was released after negotiating a treaty, and initially the empire's territorial losses were fairly contained. What did enormous long-term damage was what followed at home. Romanos was overthrown in a political struggle almost as soon as he returned, and the resulting years of civil war among Byzantine factions left Anatolia, the empire's traditional heartland, its main source of soldiers, grain, and tax revenue, dangerously undefended. Turkish groups, some invited in by rival Byzantine claimants as mercenaries in their own internal conflicts, poured into the interior over the following decade. By the 1080s, much of central and eastern Anatolia, land that had been solidly Byzantine for centuries, had slipped out of imperial control, settled increasingly by Turkish groups, and ruled in parts by a new Seljuk offshoot, known as the Sultanate of Rum. This was the world that Alexios I Komnenos inherited when he took the Byzantine throne in 1081, seizing it through the kind of internal maneuvering common to Byzantine politics. Alexios was a capable and pragmatic ruler, and much of his reign was spent doing something close to damage control, holding the empire together against threats from multiple directions at once. Normans pressing from southern Italy across the Adriatic, Pechenegs raiding from the north across the Danube, and the ongoing, grinding loss of Anatolian territory and revenue in the east. By the early 1090s, Alexios judged that he needed additional soldiers, and he looked, as Byzantine emperors sometimes had before him, toward the west. Western knights had a reputation, not entirely undeserved, for heavy cavalry that Byzantine commanders respected and had made use of before, generally in modest numbers, hired as mercenary contingents to fight alongside Byzantine forces under Byzantine command. It is very likely that this is what Alexios expected when he sent envoys to Pope Urban II in 1095. Professional, relatively disciplined bodies of knights, arriving in the kind of numbers a mercenary contract might reasonably produce, to help retake lost Anatolian territory and shore up the empire's eastern frontier. What Alexios received instead, within a year, was something categorically different. Vast, loosely organized, only partially under anyone's central command, moving not as auxiliaries in Byzantine service, but as an independent religious movement, with its own goals, its own leadership disputes, and its own destination fixed not on Anatolia, but on Jerusalem itself. Whatever Alexios had imagined when he made his request, this was not it, and the mismatch between what he asked for and what arrived would shape and complicate Byzantine relations with the Crusaders for the rest of the movement's history. The gap between Alexios's request and what actually mobilized in Western Europe can be explained largely by one man, Pope Urban II, and one speech he gave in November of 1095 at a church council in the French town of Clermont. Urban was, by training and temperament, a skilled and careful political operator, shaped by decades of reform-minded churchmen who had spent the 11th century trying to strengthen papal authority, reduce the ability of secular rulers to control church appointments, and generally assert the primacy of Rome within Christendom. He had travelled through France for much of 1095, holding councils, and at Clermont, after the council's formal business concluded, he addressed a large outdoor crowd, clergy and laypeople together, with what would become one of the most consequential speeches in medieval history. Here it is worth pausing on something historians are careful about. We do not actually have Urban's words. No transcript survives from Clermont itself. What we have instead are several later accounts, written by chroniclers years afterward, some of whom may have been present, some of whom were writing after the First Crusade's unexpected success and shaping their account of the speech accordingly, with the benefit of hindsight and no small amount of triumphant retelling. The famous lines sometimes quoted today, vivid calls to arms, promises and phrases attributed directly to Urban, should be understood as reconstructions filtered through later memory and later purpose, not verbatim transcription. What we can say with more confidence is the shape of the message, since it is consistent enough across the various accounts and consistent with what followed. Urban appears to have called on Frankish Christians to march east to aid their fellow Christians in Byzantium and to help recover Jerusalem, framing the expedition as an armed pilgrimage. And this was the genuinely novel part. Pilgrimage already carried the promise of penance and spiritual benefit. War, by contrast, was something the Church had spent generations trying to restrain among Christians, through things like the Peace of God and Truce of God movements, which attempted to limit private warfare and protect non-combatants. Urban's offer fused these two categories in a way that had no clean precedent. Those who took up arms and marched to Jerusalem with the right intention, enduring the hardship as an act of penance, would receive a remission of the temporal punishment due for their confessed sins. For a warrior class that had few socially respectable outlets for expressing genuine religious devotion, this was an extraordinary offer, a way to be both a soldier and, in the eyes of the Church, something close to a penitent pilgrim at the same time. The message spread with a speed that surprised even the churchmen who launched it. Urban had intended a departure date roughly a year out, in August 1096, giving time for organized preparation among the nobility. But sermons preached by traveling clergy carried the appeal into towns and villages across France and into the Rhineland and beyond, and popular enthusiasm outran anyone's ability to organize or control it. Long before the great princely armies that Urban had likely envisioned were ready to move, a very different kind of expedition was already on the road. Among the preachers who carried Urban's appeal beyond the halls of the nobility, one name stands out clearly in the sources: Peter the Hermit, an itinerant preacher from the region around Amiens, who seems to have possessed a genuinely remarkable gift for moving crowds. Later legend would credit Peter with inspiring the entire crusade, even claiming he had received a vision at the Holy Sepulchre years before Clermont, a story most historians treat with real skepticism. What is clearer is that by the spring of 1096, Peter had gathered a following that numbered, by contemporary estimate, in the tens of thousands, a mix of poorer knights, but overwhelmingly ordinary people, peasants, artisans, and their families, some bringing wives and children, moving east with little military training, limited supplies, and an intensity of religious expectation that in places curdled into something violent. It was several of these popular bands, moving through the Rhineland in the spring of 1096, that carried out one of the darkest episodes connected to the crusading movement's beginning. In cities including Worms, Mainz, and Cologne, armed crowds, not, it should be said, primarily Peter's own following, but other loosely organized groups, inspired by the same wave of religious fervor, in this case led by figures such as Count Emicho of Flonheim, turned on local Jewish communities. The reasoning offered by contemporary sources, and it is reasoning rather than justification, framed the violence as directed at those seen as enemies of Christ closer to home, before the army had even begun its journey east. Jewish communities in these cities, some of the oldest and most established in Europe, appealed for protection to local bishops, and some bishops did try to shelter them, with mixed and often tragic success. Contemporary Hebrew chronicles, written by members of these communities in the aftermath, describe massacres, forced conversions, and instances of Jews choosing to take their own lives and the lives of their families, rather than submit to conversion or slaughter. Accounts that are harrowing to read, and that stand as one of the clearest instances in this story, where the human cost of the crusading movement fell on people who had no part whatsoever in the conflict over Jerusalem. These events were not sanctioned by Urban or by the church's official leadership, and some churchmen actively condemned them, but they emerged from the same current of apocalyptic and penitential fervor that the call to crusade had unleashed, and they set a grim pattern that would recur, in smaller ways, in later crusading expeditions. The main bodies of the People's Crusade, meanwhile, pressed on eastward through Hungary and the Balkans, and the journey was difficult and often violent in its own right. Poorly supplied and loosely disciplined, groups within this movement clashed repeatedly with local populations over food and plunder, provoking retaliatory attacks that thinned their numbers considerably before they ever reached Byzantine territory. By the time surviving elements reached Constantinople in the summer of 1096, Alexios I, watching a chaotic, undisciplined mass gather outside his capital, moved quickly to ferry them across the Bosphorus into Anatolia, likely eager to have them out of the city and off his hands before their presence caused unrest closer to home. Once in Anatolia, separated from Byzantine protection and facing the territory of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, the People's Crusade fractured further, with rival bands quarreling over supplies and strategy. In the autumn of 1096, a large portion of the force was drawn into an ambush near Sivatot, laid by Turkish forces under Kilij Aslan, and the result was a rout, with many thousands killed or captured. Peter the Hermit himself was, by chance, in Constantinople at the time and survived. He would go on to accompany the main crusading army as a respected, if largely non-military figure. But the popular movement he had helped set in motion was effectively destroyed in Anatolia before the organized princely armies had even left Europe. The armies that Urban had, in effect, been waiting for, better armed, better provisioned, and led by members of the regional nobility, began departing in the late summer and autumn of 1096, traveling by several distinct routes toward a common gathering point, Constantinople. There was no single supreme commander. This is worth understanding clearly because it explains much of what follows. The First Crusade was, from the outset, a coalition of largely independent lords, each bringing his own retinue, his own resources, and his own ambitions, cooperating out of shared purpose and practical necessity, rather than any formal chain of command. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, led a substantial force from the Rhineland and Lorraine down through Hungary, the same overland route the People's Crusade had taken, though Godfrey's better organized and better disciplined army negotiated passage with far less friction. His younger brother, Baldwin of Boulogne, traveled with him and would later play a decisive role of his own. From southern Italy came Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman lord, son of the famous Robert Guiscard, who had spent years fighting Byzantine forces in the Balkans and knew the empire and its emperor better than perhaps any other crusade leader, a familiarity that bred as much wariness as it did practical advantage. Bohemon's force sailed across the Adriatic and marched through Byzantine Greece and Macedonia toward Constantinople, accompanied by his nephew Tancred, who would prove to be one of the more restless and ambitious younger commanders of the entire expedition. From southern France came Raymond of Saint-Gilles, Count of Toulouse, already an older man by the standards of the age, and one of the wealthiest lords in the whole crusading host, traveling with a large following via northern Italy and Slavic Dalmatia, a difficult, mountainous route, before turning south toward Constantinople through Byzantine territory. And from the north of France came a group of noble relatives and allies, including Robert Curthose, Duke of Normandy, and brother of the King of England, his brother-in-law Stephen of Blois, and Robert II, Count of Flanders, traveling south through Italy, wintering there, and crossing the Adriatic by ship in the spring of 1097. 4 separate armies, then, converging on Constantinople from 4 different directions and arriving across a span of months rather than all at once, which meant that Alexios had to manage this delicate diplomatic and logistical problem piecemeal, negotiating with each contingent as it arrived, rather than with the crusade as a single body. And Alexios had real concerns. He had asked for auxiliary soldiers. Instead, tens of thousands of armed Westerners, including powerful independent lords with their own ambitions, some of them, Bohemond especially, men who had made war on Byzantium within living memory, were now converging on his capital. Alexios's response was to require, from each crusade leader in turn, an oath, broadly, that any Byzantine territory the crusade recaptured on its way east would be restored to imperial control, and that the leaders would acknowledge Alexios's overlordship in some form. Most of the leaders swore this oath, some more willingly than others, often after a period of tense standoff outside the walls of Constantinople, with Byzantine forces and Crusader camps eyeing each other warily across the city's formidable defenses. In exchange, Alexios provided guides, supplies, and in some cases, naval support for the crossing into Anatolia. It was an uneasy arrangement from the start, built on mutual need rather than mutual trust, and it would fray, chapter by chapter, as the crusade moved further from Byzantine reach and further from any practical ability Alexios had to enforce it. By the late spring of 1097, the assembled armies had crossed the Bosphorus into Anatolia, the same Anatolia that Byzantium had lost so much of since Manzikert, and the first real test of what this campaign could actually accomplish. The first target was Nicaea, a well-fortified city not far from the Bosphorus that served as the capital of the Sultanate of Rum under Kilij Arslan, the same Turkish leader who had destroyed the People's Crusade the previous autumn, and who, having dealt with that undisciplined force, appears to have badly underestimated what was now approaching. The Crusader siege of Nicaea, in May and June of 1097, combined the Western armies on land with Byzantine naval support on the adjacent lake that bordered the city, cutting off the garrison's escape route by water. After weeks of siege, the city's defenders negotiated a surrender directly with Byzantine officials, handing the city over to Alexios's forces rather than to the Crusaders, a pragmatic arrangement that avoided a destructive sack, but one that left many Crusaders feeling that the spoils they might have expected had been quietly taken from them. It was an early sign of the friction that Byzantine and Crusader interests, while aligned in the broadest sense, did not always align in the particulars. From Nicaea, the combined Crusader force moved southeast across the Anatolian plateau, and it was here that the campaign's central and unglamorous truth became clear. This was, above nearly everything else, a logistical undertaking of staggering difficulty. Anatolia, in high summer, is hot, and much of the interior plateau is dry, with water sources that were often known to local Turkish forces and unfamiliar to the Crusaders. Near Dorylaeum, in early July 1097, a Turkish force under Kilij Arslan attacked the vanguard of the Crusader army, the contingents traveling somewhat separately under Bohemond and other leaders, in a fast-moving battle characteristic of Turkish horse archer tactics, harassing fire from a distance, feigned retreats, an attempt to encircle and wear down the heavier, slower Western cavalry before it could close and fight at close range, where Western knights held a clear advantage. The vanguard held under considerable pressure until the second half of the Crusader army, marching not far behind, arrived and turned the battle decisively in the Crusaders' favor. Dorylaeum was an important victory, but what followed mattered just as much. The march that continued southeast and then south across Anatolia toward Cilicia and northern Syria stretched through the height of summer, across terrain with limited forage and limited water, and the toll on men, and especially on horses, was severe. Many Crusaders who had set out mounted arrived at their next major destination on foot, their horses dead of exhaustion, thirst, or simple lack of fodder. Supply had to be gathered as the army moved, foraged, purchased from local populations where possible, occasionally seized, and disease followed hunger and heat as it reliably does on any pre-modern campaign. Byzantine guides, provided under the earlier agreements with Alexios, helped direct the march along routes with at least some access to water and supply, and this Byzantine logistical support, often underappreciated in popular retellings of the Crusade, was a real and significant contribution to the army's survival across some of the hardest stretches of the journey. By early autumn of 1097, the exhausted but still largely intact main army had crossed the breadth of Anatolia and reached the northern edge of Syria. Ahead of them, on a river plain framed by mountains, stood the ancient and formidably fortified city of Antioch, and it is there that the Crusade would face its longest and most consequential ordeal yet. Antioch was not simply another walled city. Founded in antiquity, it had grown across centuries into one of the great cities of the eastern Mediterranean world, and its fortifications reflected that status. The walls, built and rebuilt over hundreds of years, climbed from the plain of the Orontes River up the steep slope of Mount Silpius behind the city, studded with towers, enclosing an area so large that a besieging army could not realistically surround it completely without an enormous force of its own. Inside, the city held a substantial population, including a significant Christian community, under a Turkish garrison commanded by Yagi Siyan, who governed the city with evident wariness of both the Crusaders outside and his own restive population within. The siege began in October 1097, and would stretch on, in one form or another, for the better part of 8 months. For the Crusaders, it became less a single dramatic confrontation than a long war of attrition against hunger, weather, and morale. The surrounding countryside, thoroughly foraged within the first weeks, could not sustain an army of this size indefinitely, and as autumn turned to a wet, cold winter, supplies dwindled sharply. Chroniclers describe Crusaders eating pack animals and eventually resorting to more desperate measures, while sickness spread through the camp. Desertion became a real problem. Some historians point to Stephen of Blois' later departure, before the siege's end, as one visible example of a wider pattern of men who simply judged the expedition lost and made their way home or toward the coast. The political dynamics inside the Crusader leadership grew more tangled as the siege dragged on. Raymond of Toulouse and Bohemond of Taranto, in particular, emerged as rivals for what both men clearly hoped might be personal control of the city, should it ever fall, a possibility that sat uneasily against the oath sworn to Alexios, promising the return of reconquered Byzantine territory. Antioch had been a Byzantine city within living memory, lost only in the 1080s, and its restoration to imperial rule was very much within the letter of what the Crusader leaders had promised. Bohemond, in particular, seems to have had little intention of honoring that promise, if he could secure the city for himself instead. The city finally fell in early June 1098, and it fell through negotiation, rather than direct assault. Bohemond made secret contact with an officer inside the city, an Armenian commander of one of the towers, named Firuz in the Latin sources, who for reasons the sources describe variously, personal grievance, bribery, or some combination, agreed to admit Crusader forces by night. Bohemond, before revealing this arrangement to the other leaders, extracted a commitment from them that whoever managed to take the city would be allowed to keep it, effectively maneuvering his rivals into ceding him the very claim he wanted. On the night of the 2nd and 3rd of June, Crusader forces climbed into the city through Firuz's tower, opened a gate, and Antioch, after 8 months of siege, fell in a matter of hours, with much of the garrison and many residents killed in the chaotic capture. What followed was almost immediate and almost fatal for the entire expedition. Within days of finally taking Antioch, the Crusaders found themselves besieged in turn, trapped inside the city they had just captured by a large relieving army under Kaboga, the powerful Turkish ruler, or Atabeg, of Mosul, who had gathered a coalition of regional Muslim forces, itself an alliance held together loosely and with real internal tension, since several of the participating rulers regarded Kaboga's own growing power with as much suspicion as they regarded the Crusaders. Inside Antioch, the Crusaders, who only days earlier had been starving outside the walls, now found themselves starving inside them, cut off, with reports of men eating leather and boiled vegetation, and morale collapsing toward outright despair. It was in this desperate context that a Provençal pilgrim named Peter Bartholomew announced a series of visions revealing the location, inside Antioch's cathedral, of the Holy Lance, the spear believed to have pierced Christ's side at the crucifixion. A relic was duly unearthed after digging in the cathedral floor, and whatever its actual origin, the discovery had an enormous effect on Crusader morale at precisely the moment it was most needed, understood by many in the army as a divine sign that God had not abandoned them. It is worth saying plainly that the authenticity of the relic was disputed even at the time. Bohemond and others were skeptical, and the controversy over the lance would resurface bitterly in the following months, eventually leading Peter Bartholomew to undergo a trial by fire to prove his claim, an ordeal from which he died of his injuries days later. But in June 1098, the immediate effect was real. A demoralized, starving army found renewed will to fight. On the 28th of June, the Crusader army marched out of Antioch to meet Kaboga's besieging force in open battle, rather than wait to be starved into surrender. The exact reasons for the Crusaders' victory that day are debated by historians. Some point to disunity and mistrust within Kaboga's own coalition, which may have undermined a coordinated Muslim response. Others to the desperate, almost fatalistic determination of an army that had nothing left to lose. Whatever the combination of causes, Kerboga's forces broke and fled, and Antioch, so nearly the site of the Crusades' total destruction, instead became the scene of one of its most improbable victories. The dispute over who would actually rule the city, however, did not end with the battle. Bohemond held on to Antioch, resisting pressure from Raymond of Toulouse and others to hand it over to Byzantine authority, as the earlier oaths had promised. Alexios, for his part, had begun marching to relieve the city, but had turned back before reaching it, having received reports, apparently mistaken, though understandable given the circumstances, that the Crusader cause at Antioch was already lost. That single decision, a retreat made on faulty intelligence, would be cited for years afterward as justification, real or convenient, for treating the oaths to Byzantium as void, and it left a lasting scar on relations between the Crusaders and the empire that had helped make their journey possible. The months following the victory at Antioch were not, as might be expected, months of triumphant advance toward Jerusalem. They were, instead, months of hesitation, illness, and continued rivalry among the Crusader leadership, with Bohemond consolidating his hold on Antioch and Raymond of Toulouse occupying himself, not entirely successfully, with the nearby town of Ma'arat al-Numan, where a further siege led to another episode of severe hunger among the besiegers, and, according to several chronicler accounts, incidents of Crusaders resorting to eating the flesh of the dead, a detail recorded by more than one contemporary source, and one that later chroniclers themselves treated with evident horror, not celebration. It was pressure from below, the ordinary soldiers and poorer pilgrims within the army, who had joined this expedition for the specific purpose of reaching Jerusalem, and had little patience for the territorial ambitions of their leaders, that eventually forced the march to resume. In January 1099, Raymond of Toulouse, perhaps hoping to claim the mantle of leadership that his rivalry with Bohemond had cost him at Antioch, led the army southward along the Mediterranean coast. The coastal route mattered enormously, and it is worth understanding why. Moving along the shoreline of what is today Lebanon and Israel kept the army within reach of the sea, where friendly or at least neutral shipping, increasingly vessels from the Italian maritime cities of Genoa and Pisa, drawn east by the prospect of trade privileges in any territory the Crusaders might take, could resupply them with food and materiel that the surrounding countryside could not reliably provide. It also meant moving through a political patchwork of local rulers, many of them nominally subject to the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, but operating with considerable independence, who generally preferred to negotiate safe passage and provisions in exchange for the Crusaders simply moving on, rather than risking a fight with an army that had, by this point, a fearsome reputation. Coastal towns such as Tripoli, Beirut, and Sidon offered markets and, in several cases, guides, in exchange for the army's continued march southward rather than a siege. Jerusalem itself, at this point, was not under the control of the Seljuk Turks the Crusaders had been fighting across Anatolia and northern Syria. In the summer of 1098, while the Crusaders were still occupied at Antioch, the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt had retaken the city from its Seljuk-aligned governor, restoring Shia Fatimid rule over Jerusalem after roughly 2 decades of Sunni Turkish control. The Fatimids had, in fact, sent envoys to the Crusader camp during the siege of Antioch, apparently hoping to explore some kind of arrangement, perhaps a division of territory, with the Crusaders left to deal with the Seljuk powers of Syria, while Fatimid Jerusalem remained undisturbed. Whatever the Fatimids hoped for, the Crusader leadership was not interested in negotiating away the movement's central goal, and by early June 1099, Having marched down the coast and then turned inland, the crusading army came, at last, within sight of Jerusalem. The final approach was slow, almost hesitant, as if the army itself needed time to absorb what it was looking at. After nearly 3 years of marching, after Nicaea and Dorylaeum and the long, thirsty crossing of Anatolia, after the siege and the starvation and the near destruction at Antioch, the walls of the holy city rose ahead of them across a landscape of dry hills, and it is there, on the 7th of June 1099, that the final chapter of this long and costly journey began. The army that arrived outside Jerusalem in early June numbered, by most modern historical estimates, somewhere in the range of 13,000 to 15,000 people capable of fighting, along with a considerable number of non-combatant pilgrims, a fraction of the far larger host, likely several times that size, that had originally set out from Europe 3 years earlier. The medieval chronicles themselves often give wildly larger figures, sometimes describing armies in the hundreds of thousands. These numbers reflect the rhetorical conventions of medieval writing far more than any reliable count, and modern historians treat them with considerable caution. The garrison inside Jerusalem, commanded on behalf of the Fatimid Caliphate by a governor named Iftikhar ad-Dawla, had prepared for the siege they knew was coming. Wells and cisterns outside the city walls had been fouled or blocked, and much of the immediate countryside stripped of anything useful to a besieging force, forcing the Crusaders to send parties considerable distances to find safe water, a hardship made worse by the dry heat of a Levantine summer. The Crusaders lacked, at first, the timber needed to build proper siege engines, since the terrain around Jerusalem is largely rocky and sparse. It was the fortunate arrival of Genoese ships at the port of Jaffa, carrying both supplies and skilled craftsmen, along with usable timber, that allowed the construction of siege towers and other equipment in the weeks before the final assault. The initial attempt to storm the city, in mid-June, failed for lack of adequate equipment. What followed was roughly a month of preparation, hardship, and, described by several chroniclers, though with the usual caution about how literally to take such accounts, a notable moment of collective religious observance, in which the Crusaders processed barefoot around the city's walls, in a display of penitence and prayer, a scene that captures something of the movement's self-understanding as an act of religious devotion as much as a military campaign, whatever the more worldly motivations tangled up alongside it. The final assault came on the 14th and 15th of July 1099. Siege towers were maneuvered against the walls, most significantly on the northern and southern sections of the defenses, and after fierce fighting, Crusader forces, with Godfrey of Bouillon's contingent notably prominent in the fighting on the northern wall, succeeded in breaching the defenses and pouring into the city. What followed has become one of the most discussed and most difficult episodes in the entire history of the crusading movement. Contemporary Christian chroniclers describe extensive killing within the city after its fall, in language that is often deliberately vivid, drawing at points on apocalyptic imagery from Scripture to convey the scale of the violence, including passages describing blood running through the streets in quantities that are almost certainly rhetorical rather than literal. What can be said with reasonable confidence, cross-referencing Christian, Jewish, and Muslim sources from the period, is that the capture of Jerusalem was followed by a serious and sustained massacre of the city's population, including many non-combatants, over the course of at least a day or two of fighting and its aftermath. Muslim inhabitants who had taken refuge in the Al-Aqsa Mosque were killed in significant numbers, and Jerusalem's Jewish community, sheltering in a synagogue, appears to have suffered a similar fate, in some accounts burned inside the building itself. Exact numbers are simply not recoverable from the sources with any confidence, and modern historians differ on how to weigh the more extreme figures given in some contemporary texts, but there is no serious scholarly dispute that this was a large-scale, deliberate massacre rather than the ordinary violence of a city taken by storm, which was itself common enough in this period's warfare. It stands, by any reasonable reading of the evidence, as one of the darkest events described in this entire documentary, and it would be remembered, on both the Christian and Muslim sides of later crusading history, though in very different ways, for centuries afterward. In the days that followed, the Crusader leaders gathered to consider what should now be done with the city, and with the campaign they had fought so long and so terribly to complete. The immediate question facing the Crusades' leadership in the weeks after Jerusalem's fall was one of governance. Someone would need to rule the city, and more broadly, someone would need to hold and defend whatever territory the expedition had won. Godfrey of Bouillon was chosen to lead, though he reportedly declined the title of king in a city where, in his understanding, Christ alone deserved to wear a crown, taking instead the more modest title of advocate or defender of the Holy Sepulchre. His brother Baldwin, who succeeded him after Godfrey's death within the year, showed no such hesitation, and it was Baldwin who, in 1100, became the first to formally rule as King of Jerusalem, establishing a monarchy that would govern the kingdom for nearly 2 centuries, with interruptions, through a shifting line of successors. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, however, was only one of 4 political entities that emerged from the First Crusade, and it helps to picture them geographically, arranged roughly north to south along the eastern Mediterranean coast and its hinterland. Furthest north and furthest inland lay the county of Edessa, established earliest of all, in 1098, when Baldwin, before he was king of Jerusalem, had broken away from the main Crusader army to establish his own lordship around the city of Edessa in Upper Mesopotamia, taking advantage of local Armenian Christian political networks and a friendly, if ultimately fragile, relationship with the city's Armenian population. Edessa sat further from the coast and further from reinforcement than any of the other Crusader territories, a fact that would matter enormously decades later. South and west of Edessa, centered on the city we have already spent a long chapter with, lay the Principality of Antioch, held by Bohemond, and, after his capture by Turkish forces in 1100, by his nephew Tancred and later successors. Antioch controlled a strategically important stretch of northern Syria and the surrounding coastline, and its rulers would spend much of the 12th century managing a difficult, shifting set of relations with neighboring Muslim powers, Armenian Christian communities, and an often resentful Byzantine Empire, which never fully abandoned its claim to the city. Further south still lay the county of Tripoli, the last of the 4 states to be fully established, founded through the efforts of Raymond of Toulouse, and after his death in 1105, completed by his successors, controlling the Lebanese coast and its valuable ports. And at the southern end of this chain sat the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself, the largest and most prestigious of the 4, though much of its territory was arid and sparsely populated compared to the richer agricultural lands further north. The kingdom's strength depended heavily on control of the coastline and its port cities, places like Jaffa, Acre, and later Ascalon, since these ports were the kingdom's lifeline to the outside world, allowing the arrival of pilgrims, reinforcements, and above all trade goods that could be exchanged for the revenue needed to maintain castles, garrisons, and a permanent military establishment. That last point deserves real emphasis because it shaped everything about how these 4 Crusader states survived and eventually failed to survive over the following 2 centuries. None of them could sustain themselves militarily, using only the manpower available within their own borders. The Frankish settler population, the term historians commonly use for the Western Christian population that settled in the Crusader States, drawing on the medieval label applied broadly by both Christians and Muslims to Western Europeans, was never large relative to the surrounding population, and the Crusader States depended, continuously and often precariously, on new arrivals from Europe. Fresh contingents of crusaders, pilgrim soldiers, and the ongoing investment of the Italian maritime republics, chiefly Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, whose fleets provided naval power the Crusader States could never have built on their own, in exchange for valuable trading privileges and entire quarters within the major port cities. Great fortified castles, many of them built or expanded over the following decades, structures whose scale still impresses visitors today, served both as symbols of Frankish permanence and as very practical instruments of control over roads, valleys, and frontiers that a comparatively small ruling population could not otherwise have held. It was, from the very beginning, a colonial project, balanced on a narrow and constantly renegotiated foundation, and understanding that fragility helps explain much of what follows in this story. It is worth slowing down here, because the Crusader States are too often remembered only for their battles, and the quieter texture of daily life within them tends to disappear from the story. For much of the 12th century, particularly before the disasters that would come later, these were not simply armed camps. They were functioning, often prosperous societies, shaped by an unusually layered mix of peoples, living, working, and trading alongside one another, not always easily, but persistently. The Frankish settlers who arrived from Europe, nobles, knights, merchants, artisans, and clergy, settled overwhelmingly in towns and cities rather than spreading thinly across the countryside, and this mattered. In the rural areas, the people who actually worked the land, grew the crops, tended the orchards and vineyards, and formed the great majority of the population were, in most areas, indigenous inhabitants who had lived there long before the Crusaders arrived. Muslim peasants in many regions, along with Greek Orthodox, Syriac, Melkite, and other Eastern Christian communities, and Jewish communities in some towns. Frankish lords generally governed these rural populations much as earlier Muslim and Byzantine landlords had, collecting rents and dues, and for the ordinary peasant working the same land under a new set of masters, daily life may have changed less dramatically than the sweeping political history might suggest. The cities and towns, by contrast, were where the Crusader States' distinctive character showed itself most vividly. Markets in cities like Acre, Tyre, and Jerusalem itself brought together an extraordinary range of languages and peoples. Frankish settlers speaking French or Latin-derived dialects, Greek and Armenian and Syriac-speaking Christians, Arabic-speaking Muslims and Christians alike, since Arabic remained the common regional language across much of the population, regardless of religion, and Italian merchants from Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, who by the mid-12th century held entire semi-autonomous quarters within the major ports, complete with their own churches, warehouses, and legal privileges, running trade networks that connected the Crusader States to the broader Mediterranean, and through it, to the goods of Asia, arriving via established Eastern trade routes. Pilgrimage never stopped being central to this world. Waves of European pilgrims continued to arrive, particularly around Easter, drawn to Jerusalem and its holy sites, and the presence of these pilgrims formed its own kind of ongoing economy, hostels, guides, and the military orders we will meet in the next chapter, whose original purpose, in fact, grew directly out of the need to protect and care for these travelers. None of this coexistence should be romanticized into simple harmony, and it would be a distortion to suggest that Franks, Muslims, and Eastern Christians lived in easy equality. Legal and social structures generally privileged the Frankish settler population, and Muslims in particular occupied a subordinate legal status within a kingdom explicitly Christian in its self-conception, even as day-to-day relations between neighbors, merchants, and even, on occasion, political and military figures across the religious divide could be practical, businesslike, and sometimes genuinely cordial. Truces, trade agreements, and even occasional alliances of convenience between Frankish lords and neighboring Muslim rulers were a regular feature of Crusader state politics, driven by the same practical calculations of power and survival that shaped politics everywhere in the medieval Mediterranean. It was, in short, a complicated and unevenly balanced society. Neither the harmonious multicultural coexistence that some later writers have wished to see in it, nor the simple, unbroken hostility that a more sensational telling might suggest. Out of the practical needs of this fragile, thinly populated frontier society, a genuinely new kind of institution emerged in the early decades of the 12th century, the military religious order, an organization whose members were simultaneously monks, bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and professional soldiers, trained and equipped for war. The earlier of the two great orders to take shape was the Hospital of St. John, or the Hospitallers, which began, as the name suggests, as a charitable organization caring for sick and poor pilgrims in Jerusalem, likely founded even before the First Crusade, under the patronage of merchants from Amalfi, and only gradually, over the first decades of the 12th century, took on a military role alongside its original hospital work. The Knights Templar, founded around 1119 by a small group of knights under Hugh of Paynes, began with a narrower and more explicitly military purpose, protecting pilgrims traveling the roads between the coast and Jerusalem, which remained dangerous even after the establishment of the kingdom. The order took its name from the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, where its early headquarters were established, and it received formal church endorsement at the Council of Troyes in 1129, with the theologian Bernard of Clairvaux, whom we will meet again later in this story, writing an influential text in defense of the idea that a warrior could also, without contradiction, be a monk, a concept that some churchmen of the time still found genuinely difficult to accept. Both orders grew, over the following decades, with remarkable speed, and the reasons are worth understanding rather than simply noting. Donations poured in from across Europe, from nobles and lesser landholders alike, who saw support for the orders as a form of pious giving that carried real spiritual benefit, and who valued the order's disciplined, permanently available manpower in a way that shifting waves of temporary crusaders could never quite match. Unlike an individual crusader, who typically served for a fixed period, often around 40 days in Europe, or a season or two in the case of those who traveled east, before returning home, a Templar or Hospitaller Knight was a permanent resident of the Crusader States, bound by vow to remain, and this permanence made the orders uniquely valuable as a standing military resource in a region that always struggled for manpower. Over time, both orders accumulated substantial landholdings not only in the Crusader states but across Europe, developed early and sophisticated systems of financial management to move money and supplies across these scattered properties, and took on the garrisoning of some of the most important and most exposed frontier castles in the Latin East, fortresses whose scale and engineering still stand today as some of the most impressive military architecture of the medieval world. A third major order, the Teutonic Knights, emerged later in the century. Founded in the aftermath of the Third Crusade around a German hospital confraternity at the Siege of Acre, and would go on to play its most significant historical role not in the Holy Land, but in the Baltic region of Northern Europe, a story this documentary will touch on again later. It is worth being clear about the proper place of these orders within the broader history being told here. They were significant, innovative, and in places decisive military institutions, and their castles and their battlefield discipline mattered enormously to the Crusader States' ability to survive as long as they did. But they were never the whole of the story, nor even, for most of this period, its central actors. The kings of Jerusalem, the counts and princes of the other Crusader states, the ordinary Frankish nobility, and the waves of crusaders who arrived from Europe generation after generation remained the primary drivers of this history, with the military orders operating alongside them, an important supporting institution within a much larger and more varied movement, rather than its center. For nearly 4 decades after the First Crusade, the 4 Crusader states, whatever their internal tensions and however precarious their manpower, held their ground reasonably well, aided considerably by continued political fragmentation among their Muslim neighbors in Syria and northern Mesopotamia, a patchwork of rival Turkish and Arab rulers who were, for much of this period, at least as likely to fight one another as to unite against the Franks. That fragmentation began to change with the rise of a Turkish ruler named Zengi, who became Atabeg, a title denoting a powerful regional governor, often the real power behind a nominal ruler, of Mosul in 1127, and who spent the following years steadily extending his control across northern Syria, eventually gaining Aleppo as well, and becoming, by the 1130s, the single most powerful Muslim ruler in the region bordering the Crusader states. Zengi's ambitions were not primarily framed, at least at first, as a religious campaign against the Franks specifically. He was a regional power builder who fought Muslim rivals as readily as Christian ones, and his consolidation of Mosul and Aleppo under a single ruler was, in the first instance, simply a shift in the regional balance of power. But that shift mattered enormously for the county of Edessa, the northernmost and most exposed of the Crusader states, which bordered Zengi's expanding territory directly, and which had, over the preceding years, weakened its own position through internal disputes and strained relations with the local Armenian population it depended on for support. In late 1144, with the county's ruler, Jocelyn II, absent from the city with much of his military strength, Zengi moved against Edessa itself, besieging the city and breaching its walls after a siege of roughly 4 weeks. The fall of Edessa on Christmas Eve of 1144 was followed by a serious massacre of the city's population and the effective end of the county as an independent Crusader state, though Jocelyn himself continued to hold territory west of the Euphrates for some years afterward. News of Edessa's fall reached Europe over the following months and produced a genuine shock, the first time since the Crusader states' establishment that one of them had fallen entirely to a Muslim power. It raised, in a way nothing had since 1099, the question of whether the whole project of the Latin East could be sustained, and it prompted the papacy, and one of the most influential churchmen of the age, to call once again for a great armed expedition to the east. Nur al-Din, Zengi's son, inherited control of Aleppo on his father's death in 1146, and proved, over the following decades, to be a far more capable and far more consistently focused ruler than his father had been, combining steady territorial consolidation with a genuine and by most historical accounts, sincere personal piety that he deployed deliberately as a tool of political legitimacy. Where Zengi had been primarily a power builder who fought Muslim and Christian rivals with equal readiness, Nur al-Din cultivated a public image, reinforced through mosque building, religious patronage, and sponsored preaching, of a ruler devoted to jihad against the Frankish states specifically, a framing that helped him draw together Muslim territories that might otherwise have remained fragmented and mutually suspicious, uniting them under an ideology of religious obligation rather than mere conquest, even as, in practice, his politics remained as pragmatic and as willing to negotiate with Christian neighbors as any successful medieval rulers needed to be. The most consequential arena of Nur al-Din's later career, though, was not Syria but Egypt, and understanding why requires stepping back to look at the map. Egypt, still ruled by the Shia Fatimid Caliphate, had by the 1160s become a state in serious internal decline, its central authority weakened by factional struggles at court, even as its wealth, drawn from the fertile Nile Valley and from trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and beyond, remained immense. Both Nur al-Din and the Kingdom of Jerusalem recognized what a prize a weakened, wealthy Egypt represented, and both, across the 1160s, launched a series of interventions and counter-interventions into Egyptian politics, as rival Fatimid factions invited outside help from Damascus and Jerusalem alike in their own internal power struggles, in a sequence of campaigns and counter-campaigns that repeatedly sent both Nur al-Din's forces and the armies of the Kingdom of Jerusalem marching into the Nile Valley. It was during these Egyptian campaigns that Nur al-Din's most important general, a Kurdish commander named Shirkuh, began to establish decisive influence within Egypt itself, and it was in Shirkuh's service, on these very campaigns, that a younger member of his own family first rose to real prominence, a nephew named Yusuf ibn Ayyub, better known to history by the honorific title Salah al-Din or Saladin. Saladin was born around 1137 in Tikrit, in what is today Iraq, into a Kurdish family of considerable standing in the service of the Zengid dynasty. His father, Ayyub, and his uncle Shirkuh had both built careers as trusted commanders and governors under Zengi and then under Nur al-Din. Saladin's own early career gave little obvious hint of the role he would eventually play. He served, by several accounts, as a capable but not especially remarkable member of his uncle's military household, accompanying Shirkuh on the Egyptian campaigns of the 1160s, and it was largely through the accident of his uncle's position, and then, following Shirkuh's sudden death, shortly after finally securing control of Egypt in 1169, that Saladin found himself unexpectedly appointed Vizier of Egypt, the senior administrative office of the Fatimid state, at a comparatively young age, and, in the judgment of several contemporaries, somewhat to the surprise of those around him. What followed over the next several years was a careful and, by most historical assessments, quite deliberate consolidation of personal power. Saladin governed Egypt nominally on behalf of both the Fatimid Caliph and his own overlord, Nur al-Din, but moved steadily to build an independent base of loyal officers and family members in key positions. In 1171, with the reigning Fatimid Caliph gravely ill, Saladin ordered that Friday prayers in Cairo be said in the name of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, rather than the Fatimid claimant, a symbolic act that formally ended the Fatimid Caliphate and returned Egypt, after 2 centuries of Shia rule, to Sunni religious allegiance, a moment of real religious and political significance across the wider Islamic world, achieved, notably, without significant violence or upheaval within Egypt itself. Saladin's relationship with Nur al-Din, his nominal overlord, grew steadily more strained in these same years, as Nur al-Din watched his subordinate accumulate independent wealth, territory, and loyalty in Egypt, with evident and understandable unease, and the two men appear to have been moving toward open confrontation when Nur al-Din died in 1174, leaving a young son as his heir amid a contested succession in Damascus. Saladin moved quickly, presenting himself as the protector of Nur al-Din's family and legacy, while in practice absorbing Damascus and, over the following decade of campaigning, extending his authority across most of Syria as well, sometimes through negotiation and marriage alliance, sometimes through direct military pressure against other claimants to Nur al-Din's inheritance. By the mid-1180s, Saladin had achieved something no single ruler had managed in the entire history of the Crusader States: effective personal control over both Egypt and the greater part of Syria, encircling the Kingdom of Jerusalem and its sister states on almost every landward side. He had built this position, it is worth emphasizing, through a combination of genuine religious conviction, carefully cultivated public piety, real military skill, and the same kind of hard-edged political pragmatism, alliances of convenience, campaigns against fellow Muslim rulers, calculated patience, that characterized every successful power builder of this period, Christian or Muslim alike. He should not be understood, in the manner of some later romantic portrayals, as a figure motivated purely by chivalric ideals, nor, in the manner of some hostile medieval Christian accounts, as simply a fanatical aggressor. He was, more accurately, an unusually capable and unusually patient political and military strategist, operating within a set of religious and cultural assumptions genuinely shared by many of his contemporaries, who had, by 1187, assembled the resources to attempt what no Muslim ruler before him had achieved: a serious, sustained campaign to break the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself. The Kingdom of Jerusalem that Saladin now confronted was not the confident, expanding state of its early decades, but a kingdom weakened by internal division. King Baldwin IV, who had ruled with real ability despite suffering from leprosy, died in 1185, still young, and the succession that followed was contested and unstable, eventually settling on Guy of Lusignan, a French nobleman whose marriage to Baldwin's sister Sibylla gave him a claim to the throne that much of the kingdom's established nobility regarded with real skepticism, viewing Guy as a relatively untested outsider, elevated above more experienced local barons. Complicating matters further was Reynald of Châtillon, lord of the frontier territory of Ultra-Jourdain, a veteran Crusader lord with a long and, in the eyes of his Muslim neighbors, a notably provocative record, including previous raids that had violated existing truces with Saladin. In late 1186 or early 1187, Reynald attacked a caravan traveling under the protection of an existing truce between Saladin and the kingdom, an act that gave Saladin, who had spent years building the political and religious case for a unified campaign against the Franks, precisely the pretext and the moral justification in the eyes of his own coalition that he needed to move against the kingdom directly. In the early summer of 1187, Saladin assembled the largest and most unified Muslim army the Crusader States had yet faced, and crossed into the kingdom's territory, east of the Sea of Galilee. His forces besieged Tiberias, a town on the western shore of that sea, held by the wife of Raymond of Tripoli, one of the kingdom's most experienced military leaders, who had actually maintained, up to this point, a working truce of his own with Saladin. The Crusader leadership, gathering the kingdom's full military strength at the springs of Safuria, faced a genuinely difficult decision. Raymond, despite his wife being under siege at Tiberias, argued strongly against marching to relieve the town, on the sound tactical grounds that the route from Safuria to Tiberias crossed dry, exposed high ground with no reliable water source, terrain perfectly suited to Saladin's mobile, harassment-focused cavalry tactics, and disastrous for a slower-moving force of heavily armored knights and infantry. Guy of Lusignan, king now himself, was persuaded to overrule this caution. The sources suggest pressure from Reynald of Chatillon and others eager to see decisive action, and Guy's own political need to appear resolute. And on the 3rd of July, 1187, the army marched east from Safuria toward Tiberias, directly into the terrain Raymond had warned against. The march went badly from the outset. Saladin's forces harassed the column continuously, denying it any real chance to reach water, and by nightfall, the exhausted, thirst-stricken Crusader army was forced to make a dry camp near a rocky hill known as the Horns of Hattin, still short of the lake. The following morning, the 4th of July, Saladin's forces surrounded the Crusader position completely, setting fire to dry brush to add smoke and heat to the army's thirst and exhaustion, and the ensuing battle, fought by an army that had been without adequate water for more than a day in the height of a Levantine summer, ended in a catastrophic and near-total defeat for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Guy of Lusignan himself was captured, along with a great many of the kingdom's senior nobility, and the relic believed by the Crusaders to be the true cross, carried into battle as a sacred standard, was lost to Saladin's forces, a loss that carried enormous symbolic weight, quite apart from the military catastrophe itself. Reynald of Chatillon, whose raid had helped precipitate the campaign, was executed by Saladin personally in the aftermath, while Guy and most of the other captured nobles were spared and held for ransom, in keeping with customary practice among the region's ruling elites on both sides. Hattin left the Kingdom of Jerusalem almost entirely without an army. Nearly every fighting man of any standing had been killed or captured on that single dry hillside, and the fortified towns and cities of the kingdom, stripped of their garrisons, now stood largely undefended against a Muslim army that had just won the most complete victory in the Crusader States' entire history. The weeks after Hattin saw Saladin's forces move methodically along the coast and through the interior of the kingdom, taking city after city, most of them with little or no resistance, since there was, in most cases, no garrison left to resist with. Acre fell within days. Other major towns followed through the summer, and by autumn, Jerusalem itself stood largely alone and undefended, its ordinary walls guarded chiefly by a population of refugees, clergy, and civilians, rather than any substantial trained garrison. Command of the city's defense fell, somewhat by circumstance, to Balian of Ibelin, a baron who had come to Jerusalem under safe conduct from Saladin himself to retrieve his family, and finding the city in desperate need of leadership, remained to organize what defense could be mounted, in a decision later chroniclers would treat as an act of considerable personal honor, undertaken despite the promise he had made to Saladin to come and go peacefully. Balian organized what fighting men could be found, including a mass, somewhat unconventional knighting of townsmen to bolster the city's defensive ranks, while Saladin's army arrived and began siege operations in September 1187. Recognizing that the city could not realistically hold out, Balian entered negotiations with Saladin over terms of surrender, and it is here that a comparison with 1099 becomes almost impossible to avoid. though it should be drawn carefully, rather than as a simple morality tale. Saladin's initial position was reportedly firm, framed around the memory of what had happened when the city fell to the First Crusade, 88 years earlier. But negotiations continued, and the terms eventually agreed were, by the standards of medieval siege warfare generally, and by direct contrast with 1099 specifically, considerably more measured. The city's inhabitants would be permitted to leave in safety upon payment of a ransom set per person, with reduced or waived rates for the poor, funded in part through funds Saladin's own advisors, including his brother, urged him to provide generously. Many thousands of the city's poorer inhabitants, unable to raise even the reduced ransom, were nonetheless enslaved, a serious and often underplayed cost of the surrender that should not be smoothed over. But the wholesale massacre of the city's population that had followed the Crusader capture in 1099 did not repeat itself in 1187, and this contrast was noted and valued by chroniclers on both sides at the time. Historians are generally cautious about drawing too tidy a lesson from this contrast. Saladin was, among other things, a skilled political actor whose restraint at Jerusalem served his own broader interests, reinforcing his image as a just and pious ruler across both the Muslim and Christian worlds. And the two situations differed considerably in their military circumstances, as well as in the personalities and calculations of the men involved. But the difference in outcome was real. It was consequential for the tens of thousands of people whose lives it affected, and it remains one of the more genuinely striking comparisons in the entire history of this period. News of Jerusalem's fall reached Europe by the end of 1187, and the shock, arguably, exceeded even the reaction to Edessa 4 decades earlier. The city whose capture had launched this entire movement was lost, and across the courts of Western Europe, preparations began almost immediately for what would become the largest and most militarily formidable crusading expedition yet assembled. The response to Jerusalem's fall drew, for the first time, 3 of medieval Europe's most powerful rulers into a single crusading effort, though never quite into a genuinely unified command. Frederick Barbarossa, the elderly Holy Roman Emperor, already a figure of enormous prestige and considerable prior experience, took the cross and, in 1189, led a large German army by the overland route through Anatolia, a route that, despite difficult fighting against Seljuk forces along the way, his experienced army actually managed with more success than either of the 12th century's earlier overland expeditions. Tragedy struck not in battle, but in the crossing of a river in Cilicia, in southern Anatolia, in June 1190, when Frederick, for reasons that remain somewhat unclear in the sources, possibly a swimming accident, possibly a sudden physical collapse, perhaps compounded by the heat and the exertion of the crossing, drowned. His death shattered the German expedition's momentum. Much of his army, leaderless and demoralized, dispersed or turned back, and only a fraction continued on toward the Holy Land. The 2 other great rulers of the Third Crusade, Philip II of France and Richard I of England, known to history and to this documentary as Richard the Lionheart, traveled by sea, a route that avoided the punishing overland crossing of Anatolia but brought its own delays. Richard's fleet, en route to the Holy Land, was drawn into a dispute with the Byzantine governor of Cyprus, which escalated into Richard's conquest of the island in 1191, an improvised campaign that nonetheless proved strategically valuable, since Cyprus would go on to serve as an important supply base, and eventually as an independent Crusader kingdom of its own, for centuries afterward. Philip, traveling separately, reached the Levant somewhat earlier. Both kings' destination, and the destination of the Crusades' broader effort by this point, was Acre, the same port city that had fallen so quickly to Saladin in the aftermath of Hattin, and which Crusader forces under Guy of Lusignan, ransomed and released after his capture at Hattin, had already begun besieging even before the major European contingents arrived, in an effort to re-establish some kind of foothold on the coast, from which a larger campaign might eventually be mounted. The siege of Acre, taken as a whole, stretched from August 1189, when Guy of Lusignan's initial force first arrived outside the city, to July 1191, very nearly 2 full years, and one of the strangest sieges of the entire crusading period, because for much of its length it was not entirely clear who was besieging whom. Guy's Crusader force, camped outside Acre's walls, was itself gradually surrounded by a relieving Muslim army under Saladin, camped further out, so that the Frankish besiegers found themselves simultaneously besieged from the landward side, with the sea, controlled increasingly by Italian and other Christian shipping, remaining the Crusaders' one reliable line of supply and reinforcement throughout the long ordeal. Conditions in the Crusader camp during these 2 years were, by most contemporary accounts, severe. Disease swept through the crowded, unsanitary camp repeatedly, killing, by some estimates, a very substantial portion of the Crusaders who arrived over the siege's duration, including a number of notable nobles from various parts of Europe. Winter storms disrupted supply by sea at intervals, producing periods of real hunger within the camp, even as, at other times, Italian merchant shipping kept the besiegers reasonably provisioned. It was a siege sustained less by any single decisive action than by grinding attrition on both sides, with the garrison inside Acre and Saladin's relieving force outside enduring hardships of their own across the same 2 years. The arrival of Philip II in the spring of 1191, followed within weeks by Richard I, brought fresh troops, siege equipment, and, significantly, renewed energy and organization to a siege that had settled into exhausted stalemate. With both king's forces now committed, along with functioning siege engines and a tightened blockade, the city's garrison, cut off from adequate resupply and reinforcement despite Saladin's continued presence outside the Crusader lines, surrendered in July 1191, agreeing to terms that included the payment of a substantial ransom, the release of Christian prisoners held elsewhere in Saladin's territories, and the return of the relic of the True Cross, lost at Hattin. What followed the surrender was one of the harsher episodes of the entire Third Crusade, when the agreed terms were not fulfilled within the time frame Richard demanded. Accounts differ on exactly why the delay occurred, whether through genuine difficulty on Saladin's part in gathering the required sums and prisoners, or through more calculated stalling. Richard ordered the execution of a large number of the Muslim prisoners taken at Acre, a decision that shocked contemporaries on both sides and that modern historians generally treat as a brutal, and by the standards of the time controversial, act rather than a routine feature of medieval siege warfare, even allowing for how commonly harsh treatment of the defeated occurred in this period. It should be recorded plainly, in the same restrained register as the other violence this story has already described, without either minimizing it or dwelling on it for its own sake. With Acre secured, the crusade had its foothold on the coast at last, and Richard, now effectively the leading figure of the remaining Crusader effort, turned his attention south, toward the deeper goal that had brought this enormous expedition east in the first place. With Acre in Crusader hands, Richard led the army south along the coast toward Jaffa, a march that Saladin's forces shadowed and harassed continuously, in a campaign that showcased both commanders at something close to their best. Richard kept his army in disciplined marching order, infantry screening the mounted knights from Saladin's harassing archers, moving in the cooler hours and keeping close to the coast, where the fleet could resupply the column and where the sea protected one flank from attack entirely. Near the town of Arsuf, in early September 1191, Saladin's forces pressed their harassment into a fuller engagement, hoping to provoke a premature or disordered charge from the Crusader knights. Richard held his formation under considerable pressure for much of the day before releasing a coordinated cavalry charge at a moment of his own choosing, and the result was a clear Crusader victory, though not, it is worth noting, a battle that broke Saladin's army or ended the wider war, as some later retellings have implied. Saladin withdrew in reasonably good order, and the campaign continued. Richard reached and refortified Jaffa, and it was from there, over the following months, that the Crusades' leadership confronted the underlying strategic problem that would ultimately determine the entire expedition's outcome. Taking Jerusalem was one thing, but holding it, given the kingdom's depleted manpower and its now much reduced territory, would be another matter entirely. Richard's forces advanced inland twice, in the winter of 1191 to 1192, and again the following spring, reaching within a relatively short march of Jerusalem itself on both occasions. Both times Richard, in consultation with the kingdom's remaining nobility and military commanders, who knew the region's logistics and politics far better than most of the newly arrived Crusaders, judged that an assault on the city, even if successful, would leave a garrison isolated deep in Saladin's territory, cut off from the coast and from resupply, and almost certainly unable to hold the city against the counter-siege that would surely follow once the bulk of the crusading army, its term of service fulfilled, returned home to Europe, as crusading armies reliably did. It was a sober, unglamorous calculation, and it disappointed a great many in the army who had marched east, specifically to retake the Holy City, but it reflected a realistic reading of what the Crusader States could actually sustain, rather than any failure of will or nerve on Richard's part. Throughout this period, Richard and Saladin maintained an extended, often quite cordial diplomatic correspondence, and at points, direct negotiation through intermediaries, including, notably, Saladin's brother Al-Adil, exploring various proposed settlements, at one point including a strikingly pragmatic suggestion of a marriage alliance between Al-Adil and Richard's sister, with Jerusalem itself proposed as a kind of shared or jointly administered territory, though this particular proposal, whatever its sincerity on either side, came to nothing. This diplomatic relationship, often romanticized in later retellings into an almost personal friendship between the two commanders, is better understood as the calculated, mutually respectful pragmatism of two skilled leaders who recognized the limits of what either side could achieve by force alone, rather than anything resembling modern notions of personal friendship across a battle line. The negotiations that finally concluded the Third Crusade, in September 1192, produced the Treaty of Jaffa, a 3-year truce that left Jerusalem itself under Saladin's control, but guaranteed Christian pilgrims safe access to the city's holy sites, while restoring to the Kingdom of Jerusalem a strip of the coastline running from Jaffa north to Tyre, including the crucially important port of Acre. It was, by any measure, a compromise rather than a triumph for either side. Jerusalem remained lost, but the Kingdom of Jerusalem, reduced now essentially to a coastal strip anchored on Acre, survived and would continue to exist, in that diminished form, for almost another century. Richard departed for Europe shortly afterward, his own journey home marked by a further ordeal of shipwreck and captivity in Austria and Germany, that belongs to a different story than this one. Saladin died the following year, in 1193, in Damascus, his vast assembled territories dividing, as was common practice, among his surviving relatives, and the singular unity he had achieved across Egypt and Syria did not, in the end, long survive him intact. A little over a decade after Richard and Saladin concluded their uneasy truce, Pope Innocent III, one of the most ambitious and capable popes of the entire medieval period, called for a new crusade, aimed, as before, at recovering Jerusalem. Though this time, the strategic thinking of the Crusades' planners pointed not toward the overland route through Anatolia, and not toward a direct coastal landing in the Crusader States either, but toward Egypt, recognized by this point as the true center of Ayyubid power, the dynasty Saladin had founded, and the place from which any lasting recovery of Jerusalem would most plausibly need to begin. To transport an army by sea to Egypt required ships in considerable numbers, and the Crusades' leadership turned to Venice, the greatest maritime power in the Mediterranean, negotiating in 1201 a contract for the construction of a fleet sufficient to carry a large army, along with horses and supplies, in exchange for a substantial payment. It was, from a Venetian perspective, an enormous commercial undertaking, requiring the diversion of much of the Republic's shipbuilding capacity for over a year, and Venice held up its end of the bargain, assembling the fleet as agreed. The Crusaders, however, did not. Turnout for the expedition fell well short of what had been anticipated when the contract was negotiated, and the Crusader army that actually gathered at Venice in 1202 could not come close to raising the payment it owed for a fleet built to a far larger specification. Faced with a debt it could not pay, and a Venetian government unwilling simply to forgive it, the Crusades' leadership accepted an alternative proposed by the Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo. Rather than cash payment, the Crusaders would help Venice recover the port city of Zara, on the Dalmatian coast across the Adriatic, which had rebelled against Venetian control some years earlier and placed itself under the protection of the King of Hungary, a Catholic Christian king who had himself taken crusading vows, which made this proposed target deeply uncomfortable for many within the crusading army, and drew direct papal condemnation, including a formal excommunication of the participants, once news of the plan reached Rome. Zara fell to the combined Venetian and Crusader force in November 1202, the first and clearest sign that this expedition's course had already begun to bend away from its original purpose. The second, far larger diversion followed soon after, arising from Byzantine dynastic politics rather than from anything to do with Venice's commercial interests. A young Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, whose father, the Emperor Isaac II, had been deposed and blinded by his own brother in a palace coup some years earlier, arrived at the Crusader camp at Zara with a proposal. If the crusading army would help him and his father regain the Byzantine throne, he would, in return, provide the crusade with substantial financial support, troops for the eventual campaign against Egypt, and a pledge to bring the Byzantine Church into union with Rome, an offer that addressed, all at once, the Crusade's crippling debt to Venice and its chronic shortage of manpower and funds. The Crusades' leadership, weighing an uncertain campaign against Egypt, against an offer that promised to solve their most immediate, practical problems, accepted, and the fleet turned north and east, toward Constantinople, rather than toward Alexandria or Damietta. The army arrived outside Constantinople in the summer of 1203, and after an initial period of fighting that succeeded in restoring Isaac II and installing young Alexios as co-emperor, the crusade found itself waiting outside the city for payment that the new, financially strained Byzantine regime proved unable to fully deliver, while resentment against the Crusaders' presence grew sharply among the city's own population, culminating in a palace revolution that overthrew and killed both Isaac and the young Alexios before the promised payments were ever completed. It was this final collapse of the arrangement, a debt now permanently unrecoverable, an army stranded outside the walls of the wealthiest city in the Christian world, and a new, openly hostile Byzantine government inside those walls, that set the stage for what came next. In April 1204, the Crusader and Venetian forces, having already breached the city's defenses once the previous year during the campaign to restore Isaac and Alexios, launched a full assault on Constantinople itself, and this time, unlike the more limited fighting of 1203, the city's defenses gave way completely. What followed was one of the most consequential acts of destruction in medieval European history, a sustained three-day sack of the greatest city in Christendom, carried out by an army that had, whatever its original intentions, arrived at this point exhausted, deeply in debt, and operating well outside any effective restraint from its own leadership or from the distant papacy that had explicitly and repeatedly forbidden any attack on Byzantine, fellow Christian, territory. The material destruction was immense. Churches, including the Hagia Sophia itself, were looted of centuries of accumulated treasure, relics, and religious art, much of which was carried back to Western Europe, where a considerable amount can still be found today in the treasuries of Venice and other Western cities. Libraries and works of classical and Byzantine scholarship, gathered and preserved in Constantinople across many centuries, were destroyed in the chaos, an irrecoverable loss to scholarship whose scale is difficult to overstate. Byzantine chroniclers who witnessed the sack, most notably Nicetas Choniates, described scenes of violence, desecration, and plunder carried out against a Christian population by a nominally Christian army, and this fact, that the victims of the Fourth Crusade's most notorious act were fellow Christians rather than the Muslim powers the Crusade had originally set out to fight, is precisely what has made this episode such an enduring and troubling turning point in how the entire crusading movement is remembered. In the aftermath, the Crusaders and Venetians divided the conquered Byzantine territory among themselves, establishing what historians call the Latin Empire of Constantinople, along with several smaller Latin-ruled principalities across Greece, and Venice secured for itself a network of strategically vital ports and islands that would underpin its Mediterranean trading power for centuries to come. Byzantine resistance did not end with the sack, however. Several Byzantine successor states, most importantly the Empire of Nicaea across the straits in Anatolia, preserved Byzantine imperial claims and Byzantine governance in exile, and it was from Nicaea that a Byzantine dynasty would eventually retake Constantinople in 1261, restoring a Byzantine empire that never fully recovered the territory, wealth, or unchallenged prestige it had possessed before 1204. The Fourth Crusade never reached Egypt, never engaged the Ayyubid dynasty it had originally been raised to fight, and never came within hundreds of miles of Jerusalem. Its actual outcome, the crippling of Byzantium, a genuinely irreplaceable bulwark of Eastern Christendom that had, whatever its own complicated relationship with the crusading movement, stood for centuries as a buffer protecting Christian Europe's eastern frontier, is widely regarded by historians as one of the most consequential unintended catastrophes in medieval history, and it left a legacy of bitterness between the Latin and Orthodox Christian worlds that would linger for centuries afterward, complicating, among other things, any hope of a genuinely unified Christian response to the rising power that would eventually threaten Constantinople for good. By the early 13th century, the crusading ideal that Urban II had articulated at Clermont, an armed pilgrimage specifically aimed at recovering and defending Jerusalem, had already begun to stretch and generalize into something broader, applied by the papacy to a widening range of conflicts that had little or nothing to do with the Holy Land. In the Iberian Peninsula, the long, centuries-spanning process by which Christian kingdoms in the north gradually expanded southward at the expense of Muslim Al-Andalus, a process historians call the Reconquista, though that later label somewhat overstates the coherence and continuity of what was, in practice, a long, uneven, and often interrupted set of campaigns, had, by the 12th century, begun to be framed explicitly in crusading terms, with papal indulgences and formal crusade status extended to Christian campaigns against Iberian Muslim rulers, treating this Western theater as, in effect, an extension of the same broader struggle being fought in the Eastern Mediterranean. In the Baltic region of Northern Europe, a related but distinct crusading movement developed against the pagan Baltic and Slavic peoples of what is today Prussia, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, combining religious conversion with territorial conquest and colonization by German and Scandinavian crusading forces. It was here, in fact, that the Teutonic Knights, the military order founded originally at the siege of Acre during the Third Crusade, found their most lasting historical role, relocating the bulk of their activity to the Baltic in the 13th century, and carving out a substantial and long-lasting territorial state of their own in Prussia. The papacy also extended crusading language and crusading privileges, more controversially, to campaigns against groups the Church considered heretical, most notably the Albigensian Crusade, launched in 1209 against the Cathars of southern France, a brutal internal European conflict that saw crusading rhetoric, indulgences, and organized armies turned against fellow Christians for the specific purpose of suppressing a theological movement the Church judged dangerous, an extension of crusading ideology that many historians regard as one of the clearer signs of how far the concept had drifted from its original, more narrowly defined purpose of recovering and defending Jerusalem. This broadening should not be allowed to dominate a documentary centered, as this one is, on the Crusades to the Eastern Mediterranean, but it matters for understanding how the crusading idea itself evolved. Less a single fixed enterprise than a flexible religious and legal framework that successive popes found could be adapted, for better and for worse, to a widening range of conflicts across medieval Christendom's frontiers, internal as well as external. The churchman who did more than anyone else to translate the shock of Edessa's fall into a new crusading expedition was Bernard of Clairvaux, the Cistercian abbot whose reputation for eloquence and holiness gave him an influence across European courts that few clergymen of any era have matched. Preaching on behalf of Pope Eugenius III, Bernard's appeals, most famously at Vézelay in the spring of 1146, drew a response that reached higher into the ranks of European royalty than the First Crusade ever had. Where the earlier expedition had been led by regional dukes and counts, the Second Crusade secured the personal participation of two reigning monarchs, Louis VII of France, who took the cross partly out of genuine piety and, by some accounts, partly out of a wish to atone for an earlier act of violence against a rival lord's town, and Conrad III, King of Germany, persuaded to join, according to several sources, only after Bernard's preaching moved him directly and personally. The two royal armies traveled separately toward Byzantine territory in 1147, and the overland route through Anatolia, which had cost the First Crusade so dearly 50 years earlier, proved just as punishing the second time. Conrad's German army, moving ahead of the French and without adequate Byzantine guides in the stretch where it mattered most, was badly mauled by Seljuk forces near Dorylaeum, the same ground where the First Crusade had won one of its early victories, and the German force that eventually straggled back to join Louis's army was a shadow of what had set out. The combined force that continued on, following a coastal route through more difficult mountainous terrain, in an attempt to avoid a repeat of Conrad's disaster, still suffered heavily from Turkish harassment, supply shortages, and the sheer difficulty of the land itself. Both Louis and Conrad, along with much of what remained of their forces, eventually reached the Levant, chiefly by sea, rather than by the overland route they had originally planned. A costly and demoralizing change of plan that reduced the size of the army considerably by the time it finally assembled in the Crusader States in 1148. Once in the Levant, the Crusades' leadership gathered at a council in Acre, together with the nobility of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, made a decision that would prove disastrous, and it is worth explaining why. Because the choice made sense to some of those involved, and yet turned out to be a serious strategic misjudgment. Rather than directing the campaign's remaining strength against Zengi's son and successor, Nur al-Din, whose territory in Syria posed the clearest ongoing threat to the Crusader States, the assembled leaders chose to attack Damascus, a city that was, at the time, not under Zengid control at all, but ruled by a separate Muslim dynasty that had in fact maintained a cautious and occasionally cooperative relationship with the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the years before the Crusades' arrival. The reasoning behind the choice remains debated among historians, though Damascus's wealth and prestige as a target, along with internal politics among the Crusader nobility, likely both played a part. The siege of Damascus, begun in July 1148, was over within days. The Crusader army, having approached the city from an orchard-covered side that offered good initial cover, but poor long-term positioning, made the decision to shift its position to a more exposed side of the city with less water and less protection, a move that historians still debate the wisdom of, and the siege collapsed amid disagreement, poor coordination, and the approach of relieving forces, including, in a bitter irony, contingents sent by Nur al-Din himself, the very ruler the crusade might have been better served attacking in the first place, who now had every reason to intervene against an attack on a neighboring city he hoped one day to bring under his own control regardless. The Crusaders withdrew, the campaign was abandoned, and Louis and Conrad returned to Europe having accomplished essentially nothing. The damage from this failure went well beyond the immediate military setback. The unsuccessful attack on Damascus had pushed a previously wary, sometimes cooperative Muslim power directly into closer alignment with Nur al-Din, hastening exactly the kind of unified Muslim front against the Crusader States that a wiser strategy might have delayed. And in Europe, the scale of the failure, after such enormous royal investment and such fervent preaching, produced a wave of disillusionment with the crusading ideal that would linger for years, complicating the ability of later popes to summon anything like the same enthusiasm again. The 13th century's crusading expeditions to the eastern Mediterranean, following the disaster and diversion of the Fourth Crusade, increasingly recognized what the more careful strategists of the Third Crusade had already sensed, that any lasting recovery of Jerusalem was more likely to be achieved by first controlling Egypt, the wealthy and increasingly central heartland of Ayyubid power, than by any direct assault on Jerusalem or the Syrian interior. The Fifth Crusade, launched in 1217 and continuing through 1221, put this strategy into direct practice, landing a substantial crusading army in Egypt and besieging the Nile Delta port of Damietta, which fell to the Crusaders after a long and difficult siege in 1219. The campaign that followed, however, illustrated the limits of the strategy as much as its logic. Rather than consolidating this hard-won position, the Crusader leadership pushed further up the Nile toward Cairo, only to be caught, in the summer of 1221, by rising floodwaters that the Ayyubid defenders deliberately exploited, trapping the Crusader army in terrain it could neither advance through nor easily retreat from, and forcing a surrender that returned Damietta to Egyptian control, in exchange for the army's safe withdrawal. The Sixth Crusade, which followed in 1228 and 1229, stands as one of the genuinely unusual episodes in this entire history, because it achieved the recovery of Jerusalem itself, not through battle, but through diplomacy. Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, a famously well-educated and, by the standards of his contemporaries, unusually cosmopolitan ruler, fluent in Arabic, and genuinely curious about the Islamic world he was nominally at war with, arrived in the Levant while still under papal excommunication, a complicated legal situation stemming from earlier disputes with the Pope over the timing of his crusading vow, and proceeded to negotiate directly with the Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil, Saladin's nephew, who had his own pressing reasons, chiefly conflict with rival family members elsewhere in his territories, to want peace with the Franks at that particular moment. The resulting treaty restored Jerusalem, along with Bethlehem and a corridor connecting the city to the coast, to Christian control, while leaving the Temple Mount's sacred Islamic sites under Muslim religious administration and Muslim residents with continued rights of access. A pragmatic, negotiated arrangement that nonetheless drew considerable criticism from more traditional voices on both the Christian and Muslim sides, who found the idea of trading away or negotiating over the Holy City rather than winning or defending it by force and by faith, difficult to accept. This second period of Christian control over Jerusalem proved brief. The city changed hands again in 1244, seized this time not by a unified Ayyubid campaign, but by Khwarezmian mercenary forces, refugees from the Mongol conquests further east, who had been drawn into regional Ayyubid politics, and Jerusalem would not return to Christian rule again for the remainder of the crusading period. Louis IX of France, remembered by history and eventually canonized by the Church as Saint Louis, led the Seventh Crusade beginning in 1248, once again directing the main crusading effort toward Egypt, and once again capturing Damietta relatively easily in 1249. And once again, the campaign that followed, pushing up the Nile toward Cairo in the following spring, ended in disaster. Louis's army, weakened by disease and increasingly difficult supply lines, was defeated, and Louis himself was captured in 1250, ultimately ransomed for a very substantial sum, along with the return of Damietta. Louis remained in the Levant for several years afterward, working to strengthen the fortifications of the kingdom's remaining coastal territories, before finally returning to France in 1254. 2 decades later, in 1270, Louis undertook a further crusading expedition, this time directed not at Egypt or the Levant at all, but at Tunis in North Africa, a campaign whose strategic logic remains debated among historians, and which ended with Louis's own death from disease in the Crusader camp outside the city, shortly after the army's arrival, bringing this final, briefer expedition to an abrupt close without ever engaging its ostensible purpose in any serious way. While these European expeditions came and went, the political landscape of Egypt and Syria was itself changing in ways that would ultimately determine the Crusader States' fate more decisively than any single crusading campaign from the West. The Ayyubid dynasty, founded by Saladin, had, like most medieval dynasties, relied heavily on slave soldiers, known as Mamluks, typically Turkic in origin, purchased and trained from childhood for military service, and often rising, through genuine ability, to senior military command, despite their servile origin. In 1250, in the very campaign that saw Louis IX captured, the Mamluk military establishment in Egypt overthrew the last effective Ayyubid ruler and, after a period of internal consolidation, established their own independent Mamluk Sultanate, ruled not through hereditary succession in the ordinary sense, but through a system in which senior Mamluk military commanders competed for and seized the Sultanate through military ability and political maneuvering. The most consequential of the early Mamluk sultans, for the purposes of this story, was Baybars, who came to power in 1260 after playing a leading role in defeating a Mongol invasion force at the Battle of Ain Jalut earlier that same year. A victory of real strategic significance in its own right, since it marked one of the first clear checks on the westward advance of the Mongol Empire, whose armies had, in the preceding years, devastated much of the Islamic world further east, including the sack of Baghdad itself. Having secured his position, and having demonstrated his military credentials against the Mongols, Baybars turned his attention to the Crusader States with a sustained, systematic determination that none of the Ayyubid rulers, Saladin included, had ever quite matched. Over the following decade, Baybars captured or destroyed a long succession of Crusader-held cities and castles, including the fall of Antioch itself in 1268, the principality that had endured since the earliest days of the First Crusade. Its capture, followed by a massacre and destruction so severe that Antioch would never again function as a major city, along with a string of the great Crusader fortresses, including the famous Hospitaller Castle of Crac des Chevaliers, which fell to Baybars's forces in 1271 after the garrison, greatly reduced and with little realistic hope of relief, negotiated a surrender rather than face annihilation. By the time of Baybars's death in 1277, the Crusader states had been reduced to a scattering of coastal territories, their interior strongholds and inland cities systematically eliminated one by one, and their survival now depended, more completely than ever, on the sea, on the continued willingness of Europe to send reinforcement and revenue, and on the increasingly narrow question of how long the Mamluk Sultanate's rulers would continue to tolerate a Frankish presence on the Levantine coast at all. By the 1280s, what remained of the Crusader states amounted, in practice, to a handful of coastal towns, of which Acre, the great port that had taken Richard and Philip nearly 2 years to capture a century earlier, remained by far the largest and most significant, a crowded, prosperous, still thriving trading city, home to a mixed population of Frankish settlers, Italian merchant communities, Eastern Christians, and a substantial military order presence, even as the territory it controlled beyond its own walls had shrunk to almost nothing. The final crisis came under Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, who succeeded his father, the Mamluk Sultan Qalawun, in 1290, inheriting both his father's military resources and, following an incident of violence against Muslim merchants in Acre that gave the Mamluks a clear pretext, his father's unfinished plans for a final campaign against the city. In the spring of 1291, al-Ashraf Khalil brought a very large Mamluk army, equipped with an extensive siege train of catapults and other engines gathered from across Mamluk territory, to besiege Acre by land, while the city's defenders, numbering only a small fraction of the besieging force, held a double line of walls and towers with support, where possible, from Christian shipping offshore, which remained, as it always had for the Crusader States, the one dependable line of supply and potential evacuation. The siege, beginning in early April 1291, lasted only about 6 weeks, a stark contrast to the nearly 2-year ordeal of the previous century. A difference that reflects both the overwhelming scale of the Mamluk siege effort and the Crusader States' own severely diminished capacity for sustained resistance after decades of losses. Mamluk engineers pressed mining operations and continuous bombardment against the city's outer defenses, and on the 18th of May, after breaches had opened in the outer wall, a final assault broke through into the city itself. Fighting continued in the streets and around the harbor for several days as the defense collapsed, and a chaotic evacuation by sea took place under fire, with many thousands of the city's inhabitants managing to escape aboard the ships still available in the harbor, while many others, in the crush and confusion of a besieged port under final assault, did not. A small group of defenders, including a contingent of Templars, held out briefly in the Order's fortified compound within the city after the rest of Acre had fallen, before that final position too was overwhelmed. Within weeks, the handful of remaining Crusader-held towns along the coast, no longer able to hold out alone without Acre as their anchor, were evacuated or abandoned without further serious resistance, and by the summer of 1291, very nearly 2 full centuries after the armies of the First Crusade had first stood outside the walls of Jerusalem, the Crusader presence on the mainland of the eastern Mediterranean came, quietly and almost administratively, to its end. There was no single dramatic final battle to mark the closing of the era, so much as a long, uneven contraction reaching its final, unremarkable point. A pattern, in its way, quite fitting for a story that had always been made up less of singular decisive moments than of long years of settlement, negotiation, attrition, and slow accumulated loss. It is tempting, looking back across 2 centuries of this history, to reach for a single, tidy verdict about what the crusading movement accomplished or destroyed. And it is worth resisting that temptation, because the honest answer is considerably more tangled than any single sentence can hold. Politically, the most immediate and durable effect was arguably felt not in the Levant at all, but in Byzantium, the empire that Alexios I had appealed to the West for help defending, was, within little more than a century, gravely wounded by the very movement it had helped set in motion. Not through any single crusade's original intention, but through the catastrophic detour of 1204, which stripped Constantinople of wealth, population, and unchallenged prestige it never fully recovered, leaving a weakened Byzantine state considerably more vulnerable to the Ottoman expansion that would, in the following centuries, ultimately bring the empire to its end in 1453. Historians continue to debate how much weight to place on the Fourth Crusade, specifically within that much longer story of Byzantine decline, since the empire faced serious internal and external pressures both before and after 1204. But few would argue the sack did the empire's long-term prospects any good. In the eastern Mediterranean itself, the Crusader States, for all their eventual failure, reshaped patterns of trade for 2 centuries in ways that outlasted the states themselves. The Italian maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa above all, built, through their involvement in supplying and defending the Crusader ports, trading networks and colonial footholds across the eastern Mediterranean that would remain central to European commerce with Asia for generations after the Fall of Acre, helping lay groundwork for patterns of Mediterranean trade and Italian mercantile power more broadly. that stretched forward into the early modern period. The papacy's own authority and self-conception were also reshaped by the crusading centuries, though again, not in any simple single direction. The ability to call, organize, and grant spiritual privileges for a crusade became one of the most visible expressions of papal authority across medieval Christendom, extended, as we have seen, well beyond the original Jerusalem-focused campaigns into Iberia, the Baltic, and internal conflicts within Europe itself. Some historians see in this expansion a genuine strengthening of papal claims to spiritual and even political leadership across Latin Christendom. Others point to the way the later, more clearly self-interested or internally directed crusades, particularly the diversion to Zara and Constantinople, and the use of crusading language against fellow Christians in places like southern France, gradually wore down the moral clarity and popular enthusiasm the concept had carried in 1095, contributing, over the following centuries, to a more skeptical and eventually more openly critical view of crusading appeals by the time of the Reformation. Militarily, the crusading period left behind institutions, chiefly the Hospitallers and the Teutonic Knights, among the surviving military orders, that continued to matter for centuries after Acre fell, the Hospitallers relocating first to Cyprus, then famously to Rhodes and later Malta, continuing to fight as a naval and military power in the Mediterranean well into the early modern period, while the Teutonic Knights built an entire territorial state in the Baltic that shaped the political history of that region for centuries. The Templars, by contrast, did not survive nearly so long, stripped of their original purpose after 1291 and increasingly viewed with suspicion by cash-strained monarchs, chiefly Philip IV of France, who owed the order substantial debts. The Templars were suppressed and formally dissolved in the early 14th century, amid a set of trumped-up charges whose injustice is generally acknowledged by modern historians, a dramatic and much mythologized end that belongs, properly, to a different story than the one told here, but that is worth noting as the final chapter of an institution this documentary has deliberately kept in its proper, supporting place throughout. The effect of the Crusades on relations between religious communities is perhaps the hardest area in which to offer any confident, sweeping claim. Christian and Muslim polities had fought, traded, and negotiated with one another across the Mediterranean world for centuries before 1095, and would continue to do so for centuries afterward, and it would be a considerable oversimplification to treat the Crusades as the sole or even the primary source of a lasting religious antagonism between the two worlds, especially given how frequently, as this documentary has tried to show throughout, Christian and Muslim rulers allied with, negotiated with, and depended upon one another across the crusading period itself. Often across the very same religious lines, the movement is popularly imagined to have hardened absolutely. At the same time, it would be equally wrong to suggest the Crusades left no lasting mark on how these two worlds remembered and related to one another. Certain events from this story, the massacre following the capture of Jerusalem in 199, chief among them, entered the historical memory of the region in ways that would resurface, invoked and reinterpreted, in political and religious rhetoric for centuries to come, a subject the final chapters of this documentary will return to, more directly. For the Eastern Christian communities of the region, the Greek Orthodox, Armenian, Syriac, and other churches whose long history in the Levant predated the Crusades by many centuries, the crusading period brought a complicated mixture of outcomes, renewed contact with, and at times protection from, Western Christendom, but also new tensions with Latin Christian authorities, who did not always recognize or respect the theological and institutional independence of these older Eastern churches. And, in the case of Byzantium specifically, a catastrophic act of violence in 1204 carried out by fellow Christians that left a legacy of mistrust between the Latin and Orthodox worlds far deeper and more lasting, in many respects, than anything that grew out of the conflicts with the Islamic world across the same period. What can be said with real confidence, setting aside the harder causal questions, is this: the crusading centuries moved extraordinary numbers of people, goods, ideas, and, inevitably, diseases and violence across the length of the Mediterranean and beyond, in patterns of contact and exchange that a purely military or religious accounting will always understate. Merchants, pilgrims, scholars, and settlers moved along the same routes as armies, and the resulting exchange of goods, technical knowledge, and even literary and scientific ideas between the Latin Christian, Byzantine, and Islamic worlds, however difficult to measure precisely and however entangled with violence and loss, remains one of the genuine, if uncomfortable, legacies of this long and often bloody period of contact. The Crusades did not stop being reshaped and reinterpreted once the last ship left Acre's harbor in 1291. In some respects, that reshaping had barely begun. In the centuries immediately following, the loss of the Crusader States was felt in Europe as a genuine and lingering grief, and calls for a new crusade to recover the Holy Land continued to be issued, with diminishing practical effect, well into the 15th century, even as the rising Ottoman Empire increasingly redirected crusading anxiety toward the defense of Christian Europe itself, rather than any renewed offensive toward Jerusalem. Within the Islamic world, meanwhile, the crusading centuries were, for a considerable time afterward, remembered chiefly as one difficult episode among many in a long regional history that included, in the century following Acre's fall, the far more immediately traumatic experience of the Mongol invasions, a point historians make to caution against assuming the Crusades held the same central defining place in medieval Islamic historical memory that they would later come to hold in certain modern political contexts. The Crusades' modern reputation, in both the Western and Islamic worlds, owes a great deal to developments considerably later than the medieval period itself. In 19th-century Europe, a wave of romantic literature and historical writing, produced within a broader climate of European colonial expansion into the Middle East and North Africa, revived and reshaped crusading imagery, often recasting the medieval crusaders as adventurous, chivalrous forerunners of contemporary European ambitions in the region. A reading that said considerably more about 19th-century European self-image than about the complicated, often unheroic realities this documentary has tried to describe. Sir Walter Scott's enormously popular historical novels, among other works of the period, did much to fix a particular, often quite romanticized version of this history. Chivalrous knights, noble sultans, dramatic single combats, into the wider European popular imagination, a version considerably tidier and more flattering than the historical record generally supports. At roughly the same period, and not entirely by coincidence, the Crusades also began to acquire new significance within emerging currents of Arab and broader Islamic political thought, particularly as European colonial powers expanded their presence across formerly Ottoman and other Muslim-ruled territories in the 19th and 20th centuries. Saladin, in particular, was reclaimed and celebrated within this context as a symbol of successful resistance to foreign Christian invasion. His historical memory invoked by various nationalist and political movements across the region in ways that often simplified his considerably more complicated career, described earlier in this documentary, into a more straightforwardly heroic and unifying figure than the historical evidence, on its own, would strictly support. In more recent decades, crusading imagery and terminology has continued to surface in modern political rhetoric, invoked at times by figures within the Western world, drawing, often loosely and ahistorically, on crusading symbolism to frame contemporary conflicts, and, in something of a mirror image, invoked by some political and extremist movements within the Islamic world, framing modern Western involvement in the Middle East as a continuation of the medieval crusading project. Historians generally regard both of these modern framings with considerable skepticism, since the medieval Crusades, as this documentary has tried to show across the preceding chapters, were driven by a specific, historically bounded set of religious, political, dynastic, and economic circumstances that map only imperfectly, at best, onto the very different world of modern nation-states, ideologies, and conflicts. It is worth remembering, too, how thoroughly this later, politically charged memory of the Crusades, on every side that has made use of it, tends to flatten a story that was never, even at the time, a simple contest of two unified sides, but rather, as we have tried to show throughout, a long and shifting history full of internal rivalries, shifting alliances, and figures whose motives rarely reduced to any single, simple cause. What survives most reliably, once the later myths and political appropriations are set aside, is the documentary and archaeological record this history has drawn on throughout. Chronicles written in Latin, Old French, Greek, Arabic, Armenian, and Hebrew, castles and city walls still standing across the eastern Mediterranean, and administrative and commercial records that let historians reconstruct, with real, if always imperfect confidence, the complicated, often contradictory, human reality that lay beneath the later legend. It is worth, before this story closes, returning briefly to some of the places it has passed through, because the Crusades were never really a single war so much as a long, uneven procession of journeys, settlements, and departures, scattered across an enormous stretch of geography and an even longer stretch of time. Jerusalem itself endured, as it always had before the Crusades, and as it would long after them, continuing under successive Muslim dynasties, Ayyubid, then briefly contested, then eventually Mamluk and later Ottoman rule, as a city sacred to three faiths, its stones layered with the memory of every community that had ever fought for, prayed within, or simply lived inside its walls. Antioch, once one of the great cities of the ancient and medieval Mediterranean world, never recovered from Baybars' destruction in 1268, and the modern city that occupies part of its site today is a far smaller place than the metropolis that held out for 8 desperate months against the armies of the First Crusade. Constantinople, sacked by men who had set out, at least in name, to fight for Christendom rather than against it, returned to Byzantine hands in 1261, but never regained its earlier scale or unchallenged standing, and it would fall for the final time to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, the last chapter in a long decline that the events of 1204 had done so much to hasten. And Acre, the crowded, cosmopolitan port that outlasted every other major Crusader stronghold, fell quietly into Mamluk hands in 1291 and would not become a significant city again for centuries. Along the coastline that connects all of these places, the same coastline that carried Genoese and Pisan and Venetian ships bearing supplies, pilgrims, and soldiers for 200 years, the castles the Crusaders and the military orders built still stand in various states of ruin and preservation. Crac des Chevaliers above its valley in Syria, the walls of Acre facing the sea, fortifications and towers scattered across a landscape that has absorbed and outlasted every empire that has ever tried to hold it. It has been, across these 30 chapters, a long story to tell, and a longer one still to have lived through, for the many thousands of people whose lives, across 2 centuries, were shaped by decisions made in church councils and royal courts, far from where they themselves stood the consequences. It was never one war. It was many wars, fought for many overlapping reasons: piety and plunder, genuine devotion and cold political calculation, dynastic ambition and civic pride, fear and hope in roughly equal measure, carried out by people who, whatever side of any given wall they happened to stand on, were, for the most part, entirely convinced of the rightness of their own cause. The Crusades built kingdoms and destroyed them, opened roads between distant worlds and closed others, produced moments of genuine restraint and moments of terrible violence, sometimes within the very same campaign, sometimes within the very same week. The dust that once hung over the hills outside Jerusalem in the summer of 1099 has long since settled. The armies that stood there, waiting in that stillness before the end, are all gone now, and so are the generations that came after them, and the world they marched through has changed so many times over that very little of what they would have recognized remains. What is left is the story itself, layered, contested, only partly recoverable, and, even now, still being told. The world is quiet again. Let it stay that way for a while. Thank you for spending this long night with the sleepy historian. If your eyes are already closed, rest well. There is nowhere else you need to be. And if you would like to return another time, for another story from another corner of history, we will be here, waiting quietly, whenever you are ready to listen again.